How's everybody doing? This is Mr. Arvites. We're back with our Corona break lesson. This one is going to be the first of a two-part series on the unification of Germany. So I feel like to do this lesson, you have to really kind of talk about Otto von Bismarck and his rise to power. And so that's what this lesson is going to primarily focus on, is Bismarck becoming the leader of Prussia. And then the next lesson will focus on how all of his little plans kind of go out of it. This is probably one of my favorite topics, specifically in the 1800s. He's probably my favorite character. Bismarck really does have a lot of unique qualities. He's ultra smart. This is a guy who was born in 1815, so right at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. He lives to 1898. In his time, right, Napoleonic Wars, and then the prelude to World War I. And in fact, in 1891, he predicted World War I being started in the Balkans. So Bismarck, obviously a really smart guy. So to understand what was going on, we got to understand Germany. Okay, in the 1800s, post-Napoleonic Germany is comprised of right around 39 city-states. That does change periodically. It goes up and down, up and down. The two larger city-states, the ones that are the most powerful, are obviously going to be Prussia and Austria, okay? And so those are the two big dogs, as we kind of know, right? You have Metternich in Austria and Bismarck eventually in Prussia, but Prussia being that military state, strong military throughout its entire history, Austria being a very big cultural center, also technically a military power. You could argue that Bavaria is also fairly strong, Hanover is fairly strong, but compared to these two countries, they really aren't. They're actually controlled primarily by these two countries throughout the 1800s. Now, let's also remember how the post-Napoleonic Wars really shaped up. Austria is really going to take control of Central Europe, and they're going to take control of a lot of the German confederations. When Napoleon took over Europe, he did create this German confederation, and one of the things that Napoleon's people, his ministers, preached was that you're taking over not because you couldn't fight. The Prussian army is great, but it was the Prussian army versus the French army. It wasn't the French army versus the German army, and that's something that's going to stick with a lot of these nationalists like Bismarck as they go forward. And so I think that's something like really important to kind of recognize. Now, Bismarck, again, born in 1815. This is not a rags to riches story, so I don't want you to think at all that it is. Bismarck is a junker, right? So he is a noble in Prussia, and he really kind of exemplifies that noble life. In the 1800s, Prussian nobles still did farming, and so Bismarck was actually technically a farmer, and he studied up on all sorts of different farming techniques, and he was up to date on everything. The one thing I'll say about him, as early as we know about him, he is an avid reader. So Bismarck reads everything. So for you guys who are like, I don't need to read, yes, you do, right? Bismarck read, and he pretty much unified Germany and maintained peace in Europe for 30 years. So you could stand to read a little bit when we assign it in class. So Bismarck's this avid reader, and he does have a lot of recall. In some ways, he kind of reminds me of Teddy Roosevelt in the United States, and I think that comparison is pretty good because Bismarck, just like Roosevelt, did believe that war was a necessary thing for the state to thrive. He was a big-time nationalist. He called himself conservative, yet supported liberal policies. Roosevelt was a Republican, called himself conservative, and was really the linchpin of the progressive era in the United States. So I think both of them kind of unique in that regard. Politically, Bismarck is going to give universal health care, or basically what that was, universal health care to the Germans in the 1870s, and Roosevelt campaigns for that in 1912. So some interesting things to kind of think about. Now, Bismarck wasn't in politics, and in fact, he really didn't like politics that much because he thought people were a little bit too divisive. He thought they were too kind of restrictive in politics, and so Bismarck, for the most part, was anti-political in his early 20s. He would consider himself more of a pragmatist than anything else, right? And when we did that lesson a few days ago about the isms, if you will, right? Pragmatism was that where you don't necessarily have to have one ideology, but you can solve problems using all sorts of manners of things. And that's how Bismarck really is. He is a problem solver throughout his entire reign. But we're going to start to get to the real fun stuff about Bismarck because the best part about him is his sole goal is to unify Germany, and he makes it very well known, and he's going to manipulate all sorts of situations to do it. So one thing I think we should start off with is Bismarck's first type of political mindset. So in 1847, Bismarck is going to be called to the Prussian parliament. I put it in quotations because Prussia didn't really have a parliament or a representative government like that. And so Bismarck's called to that because he's a noble, he's a junker, and he goes to it. And Bismarck was not one to hold his tongue, and he did. He got into a verbal altercation with one of the liberal members. The parliament was filled with liberal members. Remember, 1847, that's the year before the big revolt. Liberalism is taking off in places like Prussia and Bavaria. And so Bismarck gets in an argument, and basically the argument was about why they rebelled against Napoleon, and the liberals were saying it's because he promised us a constitution and didn't deliver, and so you need to give us a constitution, monarchy, right? We want a constitutional monarchy. Well, Bismarck stood up, and this is a very unpopular opinion at the time, but this also shows you kind of the dude he is, right? Bismarck stands up and he gives this railing speech, and he says, you think that that's why we became independent? No. People rebelled, people fought against Napoleon because of their love of Prussia, their love of the fatherland. It was nationalism that freed us. It was not a constitution. You don't win your freedom with paper, you win it on the battlefield. And he sat down and he got booed and people started to throw things. And as the story goes, he opened up a newspaper and started to read it and just kind of chuckled behind it. And that's the guy Bismarck was. He was not afraid to make enemies. He was not afraid to make his points. And so that's really some of the stuff that he really did. Now, so about his political ideologies, by the time we get to that 1847 Parliament, he's fairly conservative. And then the 1848 rebellions kind of solidify his conservativeness. So remember, in 1848, you had a series of rebellions all over Europe. These are very liberal revolts. They want universal male suffrage, and Prussia, is eventually going to do that. And actually, they'll do it right after that. But Bismarck looked at those revolutions as a failure. And a big part of it was because he said that liberalism was married to nationalism. And he said, no, it needs to just be nationalism. And so he really didn't like liberalism because he thought everything depended on that voting. And think about it. Remember Garibaldi? We talked about that decision, right? What's more important, Italy or voting, right? And he chose Italy. And Bismarck, in the same sense, is saying the most important thing is unifying Germany. It's not about voting rights or helping out workers and things to that nature. Now, that was, again, an unpopular opinion in 1848, but he made it nonetheless. Bismarck became a very, very vocal member of parliament during this time. And so, as the liberal revolts went all over Europe in 1848, they ultimately got put down in Prussia. It actually solidifies conservatism. A lot of politicians become conservative because they thought the liberals were too extreme. They associated them with socialism, communism, and Bismarck was a very strong anti-communist, socialist type person. And so that's one of the things that we start to see kind of go off. Now, as we get to 1850, 1851, Bismarck is going to be in Parliament, but because he's so loud and outspoken, he does make a number of enemies in Parliament. And so the decision by a couple of high-end people, they thought they could get rid of Bismarck. And again, this kind of reminds me of Teddy Roosevelt's story in when he becomes vice president, right? It was really just to kind of get him out the picture. Well, Bismarck, they're going to send him off to be an ambassador. And they're going to send him off originally to the Russian ambassadorship. So he's going to go all the way to St. Petersburg, and he's going to be in the courts in Russia. And while he's in Russia, he makes a number of contacts with the Russians. He does admire their nobility, though he does admit that their way of life is a little bit odd. Remember, Russia in the 1850s still practices feudalism. They are not remotely close to industrializing. And he notices the sheer difference between Prussia and Russia, because Prussia is like a middling industrialist state. When he gets back, it's going to go full-fledged. But he notices Russia is really behind Prussia in that regard. But he makes some very good relations with the foreign ministers of Russia. And these relations are really important because what happened in the early 1850s? The Crimean War, right? So you have the Crimean War going on. And so he's there during that Crimean War. He's solidifying some aid from Prussia, but not a lot, right? They're going to give some financial compensations here and there. And remember, Austria refused to help Russia out during that Crimean War, which is going to bite Austria in the butt in the next video. We're going to see that play out big time, okay? Now, Bismarck, as he's making all these friends in Russia, he's going to end up getting shipped off, okay? He gets shipped off to another ambassadorship, and it just happens to be France, right? Who the Russians are fighting in the Crimean War. And so while he's in France, again, he makes a number of contacts with the foreign ministers in France, military advisors. Secretly, they do some trade with the French to aid them during this Crimean struggle as well. So he solidifies some kind of like French positioning. He doesn't meet Napoleon technically. There's no like official meeting. He's kind of in the room with him a number of times. He sees the way he acts. He listens to how he reacts to certain news. And he realizes, just like Camille Cavois, that Napoleon is a romantic ruler and that everything he does is not based off pragmatism. It's not based off of like making a decision for a specific result. It's based off of honor and all these little terms that honestly in state building aren't that important. And so Bismarck is going to learn that he can use him. And in the next video, we're going to see him completely manipulate him, just completely. And the other thing that he starts to sow in France is a distrust for Austria. He begins that right away. And so one of the things the French are going to really start to buy into is that the Austrians are anti-French. I mean, the French have been anti-Austrian for like 300 years, so it makes sense that that would happen. But he starts to really kind of pitch that narrative, and we see the Austrians also, kind of making decisions that don't really react well to that. Now, again, if we want to play everything together, let's keep in mind the French are going to side against Austria during the Italian uprisings. So that's all very, very important as we go forward. Now, we fast forward a couple of years. Bismarck is just this rising star. He becomes the most well-known politician in Germany. And in 1861, we get a new king in Prussia. And now, look, Bismarck made relations with Wilhelm I by doing a couple of different things. One, he represented Wilhelm in the 1850s German Confederation Conference. And these parliamentary Congress type settings was with all the German confederations. And so what Bismarck advocated that the eventual Tsar or Kaiser do is he said, look, you can't just accept everything this Congress does. In fact, Prussia should not accept a lot of the things they do, and they would protest many of the laws because he said the second you start buying into this, you're going to become a subservient state to that Congress. And ultimately, who runs that Congress? It's not the Prussians, it's the Austrians. So here's a crazy rule that they had in that Congress, okay? There was a no smoking rule. You could not smoke inside of the congressional chambers, except for one person, and that was the representative of Austria, because his title was technically, he was like the host basically, and so his title allowed him to do that. And so the Austrian would always light a cigar or a pipe or something like that. And so Bismarck was kind of aggravated by this, and so he decided, as the Austrian ambassador pulled out a cigar and lit it, he did the same thing. And everyone was like, oh my God. And he said, what? We're all German, aren't we? Is Austria better than the rest of the Germans? And that, again, that's not a big political thing, but what he did in that Congress was he began to manipulate things throughout that entire congressional setting. And what he did is he set Austria up really for failure, and industrialization became a big thing. And he's actually going to use some liberal things to kind of twist in that industrialization, like workers' rights and giving male suffrage, because Prussia has just done universal male suffrage in the 1850s. And so he kind of like preaches that needs to happen, and Austria's like, no, it doesn't need to happen. And so in northern Germany, what we're going to see is Prussia is going to organize a series of railroads to be built, and Prussia is going to invest heavily in a lot of these northern German city-states. He unites them economically, and that brings us to 1861 when he gets put in charge of the Prussian government. Right, when he gets put in charge of the Prussian government, everyone's kind of like, all right, what is this Bismarck guy going to do? And he makes it very well known, right? It's unification. We're going to unify Germany. And he tells Wilhelm, look, you let me do what I do and you will become the king of Germany. Now, Wilhelm, honestly, is kind of a romantic ruler, just like Napoleon. And so, we're going to see Bismarck make a couple of decisions here or there. They're going to do it. But the most famous thing that he does, prior to obviously unification, is a speech that we actually have technically no real documentation of. We have secondhand accounts. We have people who were there or people who know someone who was there, and we have these like little accounts of what he said. But the most famous quote is the one that I'm going to kind of tell you right now. So this speech is called the Blood and Iron speech. And he says, look, the position of Prussia in Germany will not be determined by its liberalism, but by its power. Prussia must concentrate its strength and hold it for a favorable moment, which has already come and gone several times. Since the treaties of Vienna, our frontiers have been ill-designed for a healthy body politic. Nothing through speeches and majority decisions will the great question of the day be decided. That will be the mistake of 1848 and 1849. It will be decided by blood and iron, right? And so that iron and blood, that blood and iron, and there's a bunch of different interpretations of that quote. There's about, I think, like 15 when I was kind of glossing through them, because again, it's kind of a secondhand account. But again, that blood and iron speech, one of the most famous kind of things there, and everyone usually kind of reads about it in a Euro thing. But understand, he wants to unify Germany Iron is industry. And what is he already doing, right? He's building railroads. They're investing in factories. They're investing in coal in certain areas. They're investing in steel production in certain areas of Germany. They're creating a northern Germany economy. And they're going to try and link in Bavaria too in the south. And they're leaving Austria out of all this, which is important because Austria will not be industrialized. And then the other thing is blood. Blood means war, okay? And not to spoil the next video, but it's going to be 3 of them. 3 wars that Napoleon's going to start, and those wars are going to eventually unify Germany. And that'll be our little lesson for next time, and it's going to be posted really right after this, so they kind of go back to back. So thank you, and hope to see you next time.